Welcome, everybody. This is a really great opportunity to hear from world-leading researchers today. I'd like to thank them. Remember that they're currently in New York and the Midwest, so it's breakfast time over there. So it's we really appreciate them coming here. So there's quite a lot of us here in the seminar room, and we had 140 people registered online. So you're setting records, Jess, Mario, thank you very much. Talk about today's seminar. Jessica Calarco is an associate professor of sociology at Wisconsin-Madison after 10 years at Indiana Bloomington. And her research primarily uses qualitative methods to examine how systems of power and privilege perpetuate inequalities in education, health, and family decision-making. She's got a load of publications in top sociology journals, including the ASR, annual reviews, and books, including another one coming along the line called Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Social Safety Net, soon to hear. I'm looking forward to it. Her co-author is Mario Small, who is the Qualitative Professor of Social Science at Columbia in New York. So our former director, Mario, is now your boss. I don't know how that's panning out. You don't have to tell us. And Mario does a really wide range of research on neighborhoods, personal networks, qualitative and mixed methods, and many other topics. And this has resulted in a huge number of articles in top journals, multiple books that have been awarded many prizes. And I'd say, for example, that Mario is the only two-time recipient of the C. Wright Mills Best Book Award. That's great. So we've got two world-leading researchers here today. We're really privileged. And what we're going to talk about is their book, Qualitative Literacy, a guide to evaluating ethnographic and interview research. And it's already making a big impression. For example, sociological methods and research devoted a whole symposium to it in its review section back in March this year, four articles by leading researchers. So this seminar is going to be relevant to our faculty doing qualitative research. It's going to be relevant to quantitative people like me. We need to learn stuff. And of course, relevant to the students who are here today. So our students, Mario and Jess, have been learning in the last couple of weeks about criteria, relatively conventional ones like credibility, transferability, dependability, conformability. And yet today, they're going to learn about exposure, cognitive empathy, heterogeneity, palpability, follow-up, and self-awareness. So we've got around 45 minutes from them to tell us about that stuff, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Given that there's so many people online, I would ask when we get to the Q&A, if you want to ask a question, it's going to be absolutely essential for you to put up your Zoom hand. Okay, otherwise we won't see you in code. Okay, thanks very much. Mario and Jess, take it away. If you'd like to share your screen and proceed. Thank you.
Are you able to see the screen adequately?
Yes. Yeah. That's great.
Well, first of all, thanks for that lovely introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here virtually. Jessica and I have given this talk a few times, and we're going to proceed. I'll do the first part, and Jessica will do the second part. But one of the things that we've learned pretty quickly is that, especially given that the topic is methods rather than empirical results, it ends up being very useful to have an interactive conversation where people are more part of it than they might otherwise be. So we will probably speak for a lot less than 45 minutes and give you a lot of time to ask questions and have a really engaged discussion in which your work, and of course our own empirical work, and that of others forms some standard part of the discussion. So the book is, of course, Qualitative Literacy, a guide to evaluating ethnographic and interview research. I want to begin by introduce an important aspect of the context. which is that we're speaking specifically about qualitative work that aims to be empirical social science. It turns out that is not all qualitative research. There's a large body of qualitative work in the humanities, of course, in which the aim is interpretation or something other than produce a set of findings that in one or another way are relevant to contexts or people or organizations other than the ones being studied. So, you studied a particular site, a particular neighborhood, for example, as is common in one area in which I work. And what you want to produce is something that in some way speaks to, and I'm using that rather vague term deliberately here, to what's happening in other neighborhoods beyond the ones that you observed. So the main question here is how to distinguish scientifically sound from unsound qualitative research. And the way we think about this question is as follows. Suppose I gave you two books, both based on a year of ethnographic research at a particular field site. And I told you that one was a strong piece of empirical social science, and that the other, although beautifully written, is not. So the question is, what criteria would you use to tell the difference? Similarly, I could ask, suppose I gave you two books, both based on the same number of interviews, X, and I told you one was empirically sound and the other one was not. What criteria would you use to tell the difference? And this book, in a sense, began because about 5 or 6 years ago, I gave a lecture at Columbia University on methods, where I asked this question of a large group of both social scientists, but others. And frankly, a lot of people couldn't answer it, and there was certainly no agreement about what they would do. So that is the purpose of the book, and that's what we're going to do today. The perspective that we approach, you'll notice that I've talked about qualitative methods as involving both ethnographic research, as in participant observation research, where a field researcher goes into the field, takes notes, and the field notes are the data. But also about interview research, where an interviewer speaks in depth to some set number of people, records the interviews, transcribes them, and the transcripts are the data. These are two very, very different kinds of methods, even though they're both called qualitative. And they require very, very different kinds of skills. A good interviewer is a good listener. A good interviewer can elicit, can get anybody to talk. A good ethnographer, in the traditional sense, or participant observer, to be more precise, is very perceptive, can detect aspects of the social world that other people don't see. So they're very different forms of data collection that produce very different kinds of data, and that therefore require different skills. Nonetheless, we feel justified in speaking of them in the same context for two reasons. And the two reasons are the joint predicament they share. One is that in both cases, the researcher is much more in the data than is typically the case. And in both cases, the data result from decisions that the researcher has made spontaneously in the field. Let's take a second to discuss the importance of both of these. So, any form of data collection in which the researcher designed the process is one in which the researcher is in the data, right? So if you are running a survey, you have to decide what questions are in the survey, and those are the only questions that your survey respondents can answer, and so therefore you are, in a sense, in the data. But what we're referring to here is the fact that the data that you're analyzing are your words, your observation. In an interview context, part of what you analyze is literally what you said in the transcript. And of course, in the field night, in the field word context, with respect to your field notes, you yourself are part of the field notes. You are, in fact, the entire source of the data being analyzed. And so you're very much in the data in a much more primary way than other forms of data collection. And that matters. And part of the reason it matters is because the data result from a lot of decisions that could not be made ahead of time, that have to be made spontaneously in the field. Any participant observer will tell you that you go into the field And you have to pay attention, and you have to make decisions about what to observe, not to observe, who to follow, what rooms to go into, what rooms to stay outside from, where to stand, where to sit, whether to stand or sit, etc. So every decision that you make, many of which have to be made spontaneously when you're in the field, because you have to react to what's happening to you. If a car is coming, you have to decide whether to stop or to try to make the car stop, etc., affect the data that you produce. As an interviewer, this is of course the case. As an interviewer, the major difference between an in-depth interview and a survey kind of interview is that in an in-depth interview, you have to respond to what people are telling you and follow up on it, right? So even if you have a perfectly produced set of questions, people will say things that you didn't expect. And so you'll have to make a decision about whether to follow up and how much to follow up when you're in the field. And these two predicaments are quite important because they affect the nature of the data produced, such that you can't design strictly ahead of time a study guaranteed to do well, right? If I'm running an experiment, as long as I do everything well ahead of time, I don't have to make decisions spontaneously while the experiment is running that are going to produce the data. In qualitative research, as we define it in both participant observation and in interviewer, these are not just common, they're impossible to avoid. And that predicament is the reason this book is addressing actually quite a difficult question. Our proposition for the book is that every data collection method should be evaluated for what it is optimal for, and not for what others are optimal for. And so this turns out to be a much more consequential and even controversial proposition than one might think, because there are strong bodies of work proposing that instead there's a single set of criteria that should be used to evaluate multiple methods. You're gonna see in a minute what we mean more specifically by that. But in this particular context, what we're referring to specifically is that if we think about the major data collection methods in social science today to be experimentation, so running an experiment, running a survey, observing people as an ethnographer, interviewing people, analyzing or collecting written material, historical archives, or doing some kind of online extraction, each of those methods is optimal for a different kind of thing, is our proposition. And we should evaluate each method to the extent that it did what it is optimal for well. Our belief is that participant observation is optimal for understanding people in their contexts, and that interview research is optimal for understanding how people understand themselves or perceive themselves and their circumstances. And so what we're going to propose are 5 criteria to identify in each form of method whether the researchers actually did that optimally. And so that's what you're going to hear in a minute from Jessica. But before that, I want to begin with one precondition that is not so much a criterion, but something that we believe is a necessary condition for good research, which is exposure. And by exposure, we mean just the hours of contact with participants or at a field site. Now, this is one very clear way in which our orientation is actually very different from one that's common, at least in some circles in social science. So a lot of researchers trained in survey methods believe that interview studies must involve large samples of respondents for them to be good. In addition, they tend to believe that you have to set the number of respondents ahead of time. So you need 100 people or something like that. Others trained often as, for example, ethnographers or anthropology will tell you, no. What are you talking about? Those interviews are just one-shot interviews. You know nothing about the people, the context, etc. So that's actually not a good set of criteria. What we argue is that the precondition we're referring to is exposure, and that exposure can happen in multiple ways. So a study in which you sampled 100 people for 1-hour interviews is not necessarily better than one in which you talked to 40 people if when talking to 40 people, you spend 5 or 6 or 7 hours with each, right? Because in the first context, you'll have a maximum of 100 hours of exposure. In the second context, you may have several hundreds of hours of exposure. And so therefore, the base quality, just base before we get to the criteria, the amount of qualitative data that you have is actually stronger. So exposure, we believe, is a precondition. However, it's only a precondition. It's not all that you need. And what I'll suggest is that now Jessica will tell us, given a high level of exposure, what an effective qualitative researcher can do with it.
Let me pull up my slides, my version of the slides here, and pick up where Mario left off. Okay, so thank you to Mario for kicking us off here, and thank you all for being here and for the lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning on my end and this afternoon for you all. So as Mario suggested, exposure is a necessary precondition, but it's not enough in and of itself. And the idea with exposure is that you're spending enough time in the field to be able to achieve the other types of indicators that we'll talk about today in terms of qualitative methods. So the first of these is what we call cognitive empathy, or essentially the degree to which the researcher came to understand those who were observed or who participated in interviews as closely as possible to how they understand themselves. Now, it's important to note here that cognitive empathy does not necessarily mean agreeing with your participants, but it does mean understanding what they believe about themselves, sort of going, and even in some cases, going a step further to understand the origins of those beliefs, how they're shaped, for example, by the context of participants' lives. Empathy doesn't mean sympathy, a sympathy in the sense of sorrow or pity for respondents. Here, what we're getting at instead with empathy is that we're trying to understand what another person is thinking or feeling, what prompted those kinds of thoughts and feelings, and what it means to them that they're thinking and feeling those things in a particular moment in time. And so why this matters is that to understand how participants perceive the world in particular ways, it can help to make our research more convincing, in part because it makes clear that the researcher is taking participants seriously and that we're not just looking for evidence that confirms what we already believe, for example, when we are going into the field. And so that's a key part of why this matters. And it also helps to explain the motivations and the meanings that the participants may bring to their lives in a way that is reflective of their circumstances, as opposed to what we may be bringing in from the outside. And we can see that in a number of ways. So for example, through attention to people's inner lives and not just their outward behavior, including things like their perceptions, the meanings, how they interpret what they see, and also the reasons that they intuit for the kinds of steps that they might take in the world. We can also see this kind of cognitive empathy in part through some of the other indicators that we'll talk about today, in terms of things like attention to heterogeneity in people's perceptions and meanings and motivations, recognizing that they may vary across different groups, for example. And to that end, I think cognitive empathy is essentially the core of effective qualitative research, in the sense that many of our other indicators involve steps that we can take as qualitative fieldworkers to strengthen our cognitive empathy, to come closer to understanding the participants as they understand themselves, because we can never fully step into someone's shoes, but we can try to get closer. And we can do that in part by taking steps to achieve some of these other indicators, including, for example, heterogeneity, which is the extent to which people or places are depicted or represented as diverse. And the idea here is not that heterogeneity means, it doesn't mean comparison groups. It doesn't mean that we necessarily have to have two groups within our, if we're doing an ethnography, we don't necessarily need two comparison cases. We don't necessarily need two comparison groups within an interview sample. And we don't even necessarily need samples that match some larger population. Instead, we argue in the book that it's possible to depict and detect heterogeneity even when studying members of a single population or a single group that seems relatively homogeneous from the outside. And this matters because the social world is messy and complicated, and groups that seem homogeneous often contain a high level of variability in their experiences, in their attitudes, and even a single person may hold conflicting attitudes about a particular topic or behave differently in different contexts or in different settings, or speak in ways that contradict their actions, for example. And this gets at the idea that in a regression model, we wouldn't expect to find a perfect correlation between two variables. And the same thing is sort of similar here in the sense that when we are looking at qualitative data, we shouldn't expect patterns to hold across all people or situations. And if anything, we should be somewhat skeptical if we see too much consistency across the participants or across the attitudes that are depicted in a qualitative piece. And so acknowledging this kind of heterogeneity shows that we've tried to achieve cognitive empathy, that we've taken the steps to ensure that we are understanding each participant as an individual and not simply as a member of a larger group that might hold relatively shared views in some situations. And it also encourages us to have attention to the fact that the participants' perceptions may differ from each other, differ over time, and differ from our own as the researcher as well. And we can see this in the way that researchers will take steps to not oversimplify patterns, that we're acknowledging variations, even if we're talking about a central pattern, that we'll say, this works differently for different groups, or this, doesn't always play out in the same particular ways. And so essentially, effective qualitative fieldworkers are not trying to hide or ignore complexity, but are instead acknowledging it and maybe even taking steps to try to explain that variation, or at least acknowledge the consequences that that kind of variation can have for the participants in their lives. Now, in a related vein, our third indicator, palpability, points to the importance of balancing the need to identify patterns, the need to abstract from the data, with the need to, or with the risks of oversimplifying those patterns. And so when we talk about palpability, we're talking about the degree to which the evidence presented in a published work, for example, is not abstract, but rather complete. And this doesn't mean detail for detail's sake. It doesn't mean, adding every possible color or every possible smell or every possible taste that you encounter in the field. Instead, it's about bringing the reader into the lived realities of the participants with the goal of showing how you know what you know, in the sense that you are conveying those details that you as the researcher use to interpret the situation, so that when you present that evidence in the text of an article or in a book, that the reader can follow your logic and look at that same depiction of a situation and see how you came to the conclusions that you did by reading the evidence that you present for them. And so essentially it brings you in closer to the data, brings the reader in closer to the data, and allows a sort of testing of the conclusions through the presentation of that evidence in the text. And so at the same time, we can see that in the text by not seeing, mere abstractions, that you're actually taking the time to include evidence, excerpts from your field notes or key quotes from participants, ideally with, relatively large chunks of text around the quote, that it's not just a single phrase abstracted to make a point, but showing the context, showing you how you came to a particular understanding and how that quote was generated, or how that particular interaction that you're describing fits into a larger context within the field. And so at the same time, and of course, as anyone who's ever conducted an interview or spent time observing knows, it's not always easy to generate that kind of highly palpable data, especially with the first question that you ask, for example, or the first time that you head out into the field when you're not 100% certain yet of what your research question is going to be or what your primary contribution is going to be. And that brings us to our next indicator, which is follow-up. And as Mario mentioned before, one of the things that sets ethnography and interviews or participant observations apart from other forms of data collection is that the success of these methods depends on the decisions that a researcher makes spontaneously in the field, and that these decisions can't be made in advance. And so that's part of where follow-up comes in here, in the sense that to achieve high levels of palpability, to achieve cognitive empathy, to get at heterogeneity, to detect that kind of heterogeneity in the data that you're collecting, it often requires taking additional steps beyond what you set out to do at the start of a study. And so when we talk about follow-up, we're talking about the extent to which the researcher collected data to answer questions that arose during the data collection process itself. And this doesn't mean following every possible lead. And it also doesn't mean that you have to do longitudinal studies to do effective qualitative research. Instead, the idea here is that qualitative research is emergent. To know what you know and to show what you know, you have to go beyond, in many cases, that initial plan by talking to additional participants or asking questions that you didn't plan in advance. And that, to make sure, for example, in the context of an interview, that you understood the participant's meaning, or to generate more concrete examples if the participant speaks at a sort of higher abstract level with their initial responses, or to unpack potentially contradictory ideas. Say that you see something in the field and it contradicts what someone has said before, you might need to talk to them and say, what is going on here? Can you tell me more about, why this played out this particular way in this particular moment? And that's essentially what we're trying to get at with this kind of follow-up, and that you may need to make variations. You may find, for example, when you go into the field that maybe you plan to sit at the back of the room because that's where you feel least obtrusive. But maybe you discover in the process that you can't see people's faces, and that people's faces become tremendously important to the kind of argument that you're making about emotions and how they play out in a particular setting, for example. And so maybe you need to change where you sit, or maybe you need to change the time of day that you're observing, or you need to add, in some cases, you may need to add an additional field site or additional populations to talk to, but that's not always the case. And it's not necessarily about adding follow-up for follow-up's sake, but instead thinking strategically about what are the kinds of additional questions that arise that you need to answer to get as close as possible to the kinds of arguments that you're making, and to achieve those other indicators in terms of things like palpability and heterogeneity and cognitive empathy. Now, all of these are iterative processes, in the sense that you, as you're going through a qualitative study, you have to be making, you can't just sort of check the box of cognitive empathy and then move on, or check the box of heterogeneity and move on, in part because in many cases, the purpose of a study will vary over the course of data collection as well, that you're sort of coming to an understanding of what is interesting here? What is the surprising finding that you're then trying to unpack and explain or make sense of? And so you have to be carefully self-aware in that process too, of how you are attending to all of these different indicators as you are moving through the course of a study, and as things are changing in the course of that study too. And so when we talk about self-awareness, we're talking about the extent to which the researcher understands the impact of their presence in the field, and also the impact that their assumptions might have on the participants, on the people who are interviewed or observed in the course of the research. And the idea here, kind of similar to follow-up, is that all research involves choices, and that those choices are influenced to some extent by the researcher, not just who they are, but also by how they were trained, by the theories and the experiences that they bring to the field with them, by how they're perceived by others, and even simply by their presence in the field, that things change by virtue of being there. And so a self-aware researcher will recognize that potential influence and take steps throughout the process to anticipate and also account for the kind of influence that they may be having, and also to make adjustments as necessary. Maybe that means that you realize that your initial attempts with building rapport with participants aren't working, and that you either need to find a new sponsor who can help you build trust with participants in the field, or maybe it's that you need to change your recruitment approach in terms of gathering, finding people who can participate in the study. And so essentially the idea here with self-awareness is not necessarily to eliminate the influence that the researcher has on the research entirely. That would be impossible. Instead, it's about taking the steps that are necessary, again, to think about these other indicators. What does it take to achieve cognitive empathy? What are the barriers that we may bring as individuals to that goal? What are the barriers that we may face in palpability? If we're too much of an insider, for example, we may not notice the details. Or we may have to push ourselves to notice those details in ways that we might not otherwise if we're deeply familiar with a setting, for example, or if we are too much of an outsider, we may not notice heterogeneity. And so being attentive to the fact that our positionality and also our experiences and insights shape the kinds of decisions that we make, and that we can take steps to adjust in accordance with that as we are moving through the process of research. And so these are kind of, the idea here is that these types of indicators work collectively to improve the quality of research, but they are not necessarily like I said before, they're not checkboxes. These are spectrums in the sense that there are steps that we can take to improve on each of these measures. And in the book, we try to show kind of step by step how a researcher can improve, but not necessarily, there's not perfection here. And every project is going to be different. And so it's not going to be possible to kind of lay out, these are the exact steps that you need to take to achieve these kinds of indicators in your research. But our goal is to provide examples that can help research just to think about how they can deepen their cognitive empathy, how they can deepen their self-awareness, and how they can take steps to improve the quality of the research that they're pursuing, and also to recognize that quality in the kind of research that they're encountering, whether they are trained in qualitative research or not. So I will stop there in the interest of leaving plenty of time for questions. But yeah, thank you all for being here, and thanks for inviting us to be here today.